Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 2, Intercultural Communication. What we're going to be talking about today is a little bit different. What we're going to be talking about is how we communicate with those who are different from us. And in intercultural communication, that is the crux by which all of the challenge comes from. That there are people who are different from us, people who communicate in different ways, and who value different things, and interact in different ways, and as a result, we end up running into challenge. And while it can be conflated to the pop culture of, Indian people from the Indian culture like a certain type of music, Americans like a particular type of music. Um, Central America likes a particular type of music. It gets a lot deeper than that because culture is like an iceberg, in where the very surface level is the stuff that we see, that pop culture, that the the movies, the media that gets presented. And we may not have interaction with people of that culture in person. But when we start to delve deeper, we communicate with those who have that sort of ideology, we then start gaining new meaning behind their culture. We learn about their symbols, their meanings, and even the norms that they prescribe to. Good example of this was back in the day when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I knew my friend Petros. He was Ethiopian. And at first, I didn't really know what that meant, but I had seen a few things on the media about um, Ethiopian culture, and it didn't really it didn't really fit how I saw Petros, because Petros was my friend, and in media, there's a lot of different um, ways that Ethiopia is presented. A lot of times it's presented as poor. But my friend Petros was completely different. Wasn't that he was rich, comfortably middle class. So when I met him, then the symbols, the meanings, the norms changed. I saw a lot of things that I wasn't familiar with, a lot of artwork that I had never seen before in their household. We went to an Ethiopian restaurant where we ate with our hands. And with that, that was shocking, but it wasn't necessarily bad. Then, as I got to know him even better, I started to learn some of his traditions, some of his beliefs, and some of what he valued. And that was slightly different from mine, but still we got along. But underneath all of that, and the point of this is that yes, as we go further down the iceberg, we learn new things about these people. We learn, and a lot of these things may be shocking to us. A good example of this was in the deep levels of culture tradition. There was artwork that was of naked ladies, and I was like, "Whoa, geez, that's a little bit too much." But the more we go down, the more we realize that we all have the same universal basic needs. We are very alike. And when we learn intercultural communication, it will allow us the opportunity to learn from people with deep diversity, who have diverse perspectives that we can then learn from, but also that we can form new friendships, new relationships that will be meaningful for us, just like I had with Petros. So, how do we learn our culture? First, we learn it through enculturation or socialization. This is the process of understanding and learning the culture in which we are born. What we eat to how we sleep all come from our culture. In the same way that my friend Petros would eat with his hands at an Ethiopian restaurant, I didn't really have that same norm. Also, so there are many things that we learn through our culture. A good example of this is tipping. In America, we tip a lot, whereas in European countries, that is actually not as uh, not that much of a structured norm. So, who do we learn this information from? A lot of times it is from our um, parents, from our social relationships. What ends up happening is, for example, let's say that when I'm hanging out with friends, do not tip. Then my friends get mad at me, or there's judgment, and those cultural norms are affirmed. So, through everyday socialization, we learn our norms. Also, we have acculturation, which is resocialization when a person moves from one culture to an unfamiliar one and interacts for an extended period of time. A great example of this was I moved from Northern California to Southern California. And while that doesn't seem like that big of a move, for me it very much was. That I went from a culture which was predominantly white and Asian was now widely diverse with many different races, and the differences weren't exclusive to race. Instead, it was different traditions, different ways of being, different ways of interacting. A good example of this was I would show up on time for every single party, every single, every single meeting, things like that. But what I started to learn was that people would not end up doing those sorts of things and would end up showing up at minimum about 15 minutes late. So that showing that that is the norm of that culture. So we learn these things through resocialization. And when we do not adapt to it, therein lies some issues. So let's first define culture. Culture is the language, values, beliefs, traditions, and customs people share and learn. And bound by perception and by definition of what falls into a culture, what doesn't fall into a culture. And the way that we perceive things is culture. So we can never get out of it. That no matter what we do, if we act in a certain way, we are always subscribing to the culture. Even if we run counterculturally. Even if we run counterculturally. A good example of this is Tim and Eric. You may not be familiar with this TV show, but it was very weird. It was very anti-consumer. It was very challenging for the audience. Very awkward. But because people started to enjoy it, they then morphed the entire culture to be more like that kooky, awkward type of comedy. That's where we got things like the Eric Andre show, or those Old Spice ads of Terry Crews shooting laser beams through his mouth. Our culture can either be shaped through the media, or it can show why that is not good media. So we have culture, and it affects everything. We are constantly viewing things through our cultural lens. We also have co-culture, and co-culture is membership in a group that is part of an encompassing group. So for example, we are part of the culture of America, but there are co-cultures within that. If we're talking politics, we can talk about Democrat, we can talk about Republican, we can talk about progressive, we can talk about Tea Party. And with all of those different memberships, all of those have different co-cultures, different languages, values, beliefs, traditions, and customs that that group shares. So to further define it, we need to understand social identity. We identify to certain groups. I am an actor. I am an academic. I am a Californian. Speaking of, there is a strong social identity with Californians and the rest of the country. Because, so if you are a Californian, there is a lot of pride you feel about being a Californian, being able to go get all sorts of food, having the best Mexican food, although probably not, but also having Hollywood, having Silicon Valley, having lots of things to do. All of which we are prideful for, and that is an in-group that we can all feel connected to. That is our social identity. But with every in-group, there needs to be out-groups. And what are those out-groups? Other other states in America. That we then diverge from those different groups. What are some things we think about with other types, with other states? Maybe that they are, oh my gosh, I always would hear in high school about how California, if they broke off, would have, like, I believe it's the fifth largest economy in the world. Don't quote me on that. But that California is rich, other states are not so rich. California is very progressive. Other states are not very progressive in some ways. So, as we continue to talk about it, we start creating divergences from other cultures, and as a result, we start feeling stronger within the in-group. And while this is the way that every in-group and out-group works. I mean, what clubs were you a part of in high school? Athletics? Theater? Band? Well, that is your in-group. What were the out-groups, and how did you interact with the out-groups? So while that is a common way that we use social interaction, it can lead into a very bad mindset, and that is an ethnocentric mindset. The indicators of an ethnocentric mindset is being stuck in your own cultural worldview, using your own cultural values as standards to evaluate other behaviors. This is a good example of that, where, well, this woman has on her traditional head covering, but you know what? That is not okay, so I'm going to free you of that. Also, viewing other cultural way of living as, viewing our cultural way of living as natural, and what the way other people live as unnatural. A good example of this, again, is how many people live in your house. It could be just your immediate family, but in other families, they may have generational households where there are multiple generations within that one household. And to say that that's wrong is an indication of that ethnocentric mindset. We also have evaluating the communication norms of our own cultural group as more proper or normal, and then other groups as abnormal. A good example of this is standard English and Ebonics, about how, well, that's not the proper way of saying it, so therefore that is wrong. There are cultural ways to communicate differently, and to say that that is wrong and I am right is an indicator of that ethnocentric mindset. Just like it would be that, when someone says y'all, maybe someone from southern states or Texas, that would be improper. They should instead say you all. Again, speaking to that ethnocentric mindset. And lastly, acting in a conscious manner or unconscious manner in favor of an in-group standard to the exclusion of an out-group standard. So, while so we should strive to act in ways that do not exclude the out-group standard, and we should strive to be more intercultural, frankly. That by communicating with other people of other cultures, we learn a lot. We improve ourselves. So we should strive to reduce this ethnocentric mindset by acting in ways to engage those outgroups. And then, just like with my friend Petros, that we then start to find those universal basic needs. So let's talk about intercultural communication. Intercultural communication is where there are two or more cultures or co-cultures exchanging messages in a manner that is influenced by their different cultural perceptions and symbol systems, both verbal language and nonverbal. So where intercultural communication becomes the most intercultural is where differences, backgrounds, beliefs are noteworthy, whereas the least intercultural communication happens when cultural differences mean very little. When we interact with fellow students, for example, that might be very non-intercultural, simply because we have we are in college, we are maybe around the same age, but if not, that's fine. We all live in the same area, general area. At minimum, we all live in California. We're all American, so we all are very intercultural. Not we may not have such intercultural communication in this situation. Whereas, if let's say, for example, that someone who is a transfer student comes in, then there might be those backgrounds that are very noteworthy until we start to identify with them further, and then the communication becomes less intercultural. Speaking of salience, salience is the weight that we attach to a person or phenomena. So if we focus on those differences, then the intercultural communication becomes very challenging, whereas if we don't focus on that, then it doesn't become as intercultural of communication. But even within this classroom, there are always going to be intercultural differences, and by communicating more interculturally with people, we better understand their beliefs, values, traditions, language, and allow for our own development. So intercultural differences as generalizations. Cultural practices aren't totally different. That we are all human, so we all have those universal basic needs, and as a result, we are very much the same. We are all part of one race, which is the human race. Also, there's greater differences within cultures than between cultures. And that's something very interesting to think about, because it is very easy, for example, to uh, demonize Russia or China or anywhere else. But when we do that, I mean, there are a lot of people in China, in Russia, who are like us. But to the point where there are more people within America who have completely different views. So by reducing some of those labels and some of those um, those needless labels that can allow for greater intercultural diversity. And generalizations of certain groups do not apply, that we should not stereotype entire groups. So we're going to conclude with this section of the general ideas of intercultural communication. Next, we're going to be talking about the cultural value dimensions.